Hi everyone, I'm Jack, and welcome to English with Jack. My goal is to help you understand and speak English confidently and naturally. In today's video, we are going to look at vocabulary related to hosting a dinner party, cooking, and dealing with stressful social situations. This lesson is perfect for anyone who wants to learn how to describe daily activities and improve their British English listening skills regarding home life. If you're ready to take your English to the next level, let's get started. The rain was drumming heavily against the window pane of the terraced house in Bristol, but inside, the atmosphere was heating up. Harriet stood in the centre of the kitchen, staring wildly at the list of tasks pinned to the fridge. Tonight was not just any ordinary Saturday evening. Tonight, she was hosting her first proper dinner party since moving into the neighbourhood. To make matters more stressful, the guest of honour was her new boss, Margaret, a woman known for her high standards and incredibly sharp eye for detail. Harriet wiped her hands on her apron and took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She wanted everything to be perfect. She wanted the house to be spotless, the food to be delicious, and the conversation to flow smoothly. However, looking at the pile of unpeeled potatoes and the flour dusting the floor, perfection felt very far away. Her husband, Alistair, walked into the kitchen holding a mug of tea. He looked far too relaxed for the situation, which only annoyed Harriet more. He was wearing his old gardening trousers and a jumper with a small hole in the elbow. Alistair took a loud sip of his tea and looked around the chaotic kitchen with a smile. He asked if everything was under control. Harriet sighed and pointed at the oven. She explained that the beef Wellington, a notoriously difficult dish to cook, was not ready to go in yet because the pastry had gone a bit soft. She told Alistair that he needed to go upstairs immediately, have a shower, and put on a shirt. She also reminded him that he still hadn't hoovered the lounge or set the table in the dining room.
Alistair nodded slowly, realizing that his wife was genuinely panicked. He put his mug down on the worktop and promised to help. He grabbed the hoover from the cupboard under the stairs and headed into the living room. The noise of the vacuum cleaner gave Harriet a moment of focus. She returned her attention to the beef. She carefully wrapped the meat in the pastry, hoping it would stay together. Cooking British food for a traditional dinner party was always a risk. If the beef was overcooked, it would be dry and tough. If it was undercooked, it would be embarrassing. She brushed the top with egg wash to ensure it turned a lovely golden colour, then placed the heavy tray into the hot oven. She set the timer on her mobile phone and crossed her fingers. With the main course in the oven, she moved on to the vegetables. She had bought expensive organic carrots and parsnips from the local market. She began chopping them into batons, the knife making a rhythmic chopping sound against the wooden board. As she worked, her mind raced through possible conversation topics. She must remember not to mention politics, and she definitely shouldn't mention the recent redundancies at the office. She needed safe topics. Perhaps they could talk about their recent holiday to Cornwall, or the weather, which was always a safe bet in the UK. Suddenly, the hoovering noise stopped. Alistair poked his head around the doorframe. He looked slightly sheepish. He told Harriet that there was a small problem with the dining table. Apparently, one of the legs was a bit wobbly. He had tried to fix it with a screwdriver, but he was worried it might collapse if someone leaned on it too heavily. Harriet closed her eyes and counted to 10. She told him to find a piece of cardboard or a book to wedge under the leg to stabilize it. She didn't care how he did it, as long as the table didn't fall over while Margaret was eating her soup. Alistair gave a thumbs up and retreated back to the dining room. Harriet checked the clock. It was 5:30. The guests were arriving at 7. They had 90 minutes to turn this chaotic house into a sophisticated venue. She grabbed a cloth and started furiously wiping down the kitchen counters, praying that nothing else would go wrong.
Harriet raced up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. She dashed into the bedroom and pulled open the wardrobe doors. The room was filled with the soft grey light of the rainy evening, but she didn't have time to admire the view. She grabbed a navy blue dress that she usually saved for weddings or important client meetings. It was smart, elegant, but comfortable enough to cook in. She quickly changed, checking her reflection in the full-length mirror. Her hair was a little frizzy from the humidity of the kitchen, so she pinned it back with a clip. From the bathroom next door, she heard the sound of the shower turning off. She shouted through the wall for Alistair to hurry up. They only had 45 minutes left, and he still needed to uncork the wine and put out the snacks. 10 minutes later, Alistair emerged from the bedroom. To Harriet's relief, he looked very presentable. He had managed to find a crisp white shirt and a pair of beige chinos that didn't have any grass stains on them. He smelled of soap and expensive cologne. They met on the landing and exchanged a nervous smile. The panic of the last hour had subsided slightly, replaced by the adrenaline of impending performance. They walked downstairs together, checking the hallway for any stray shoes or coats that needed to be hidden away. The house looked warm and inviting. The lamps in the living room were switched on, casting a golden glow over the furniture, and the smell of roasting beef wafting from the kitchen was truly mouth-watering. Harriet went straight to the kitchen to check the vegetables, while Alistair took charge of the drinks. He opened a bottle of red wine to let it breathe, and placed several bottles of white wine and beer in the fridge to chill. He then arranged a selection of olives, crisps, and nuts into small ceramic bowls. He carried them into the lounge and placed them carefully on the coffee table. He gave the table a gentle nudge with his knee
to test its stability. Thanks to the thick book he had wedged underneath the broken leg, it seemed solid enough. He just hoped that nobody would decide to rest their feet on it later in the evening.
At exactly 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the hallway, making Harriet jump. She wiped a smudge of flour from her cheek and smoothed down her dress. She whispered to Alastair to answer it, while she turned the heat down on the saucepan of potatoes. Alastair walked to the front door, straightened his collar and pulled it open. Standing on the doorstep, sheltering under large black umbrellas, were their guests. Margaret was at the front, looking formidable in a sharp grey blazer and holding a bottle of champagne. Behind her stood the other couple invited for the evening, Rupert and Claire. Rupert was a tall man who worked in finance, and Claire was a softly spoken art teacher who Harriet had known since university. Alastair welcomed them in, taking their wet umbrellas and placing them in the stand by the door. There was a flurry of greetings in the narrow hallway. Coats were removed and hung on the hooks, and cheeks were kissed in the traditional polite manner. Margaret handed the champagne to Alastair and commented on how lovely the area was, although she did mention that the parking situation on the street was quite terrible. Alastair laughed nervously and agreed, guiding the group into the lounge. Harriet emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a clean tea towel before shaking Margaret's hand firmly. She told everyone to make themselves at home and offered to take drink orders. Once everyone was seated on the sofas, the atmosphere began to relax. Alastair poured glasses of wine and handed them out, while Harriet passed around the bowls of olives. The conversation started with the usual safe topics. They discussed the miserable British weather, the traffic on the motorway, and how quickly the year was going by. Margaret dominated the conversation initially, talking about a recent conference she had attended in London. Harriet listened intently, nodding at the right moments and asking polite questions to show she was interested. Inside, however, part of her mind was still in the kitchen. She was mentally calculating the cooking times. The beef needed to rest for 10 minutes before carving, and she still needed to make the gravy. She hoped that Alastair would remember to keep everyone's glasses full so she could slip away to finish the preparations.
Harriet politely excused herself from the conversation, claiming she needed to check on the roast potatoes. She placed her half-empty wine glass on a coaster and backed out of the room with a tight smile. As soon as the kitchen door clicked shut behind her, her demeanor changed completely. She let out a long, shaky breath and rushed over to the oven. She grabbed the oven gloves and carefully pulled out the heavy tray. The beef Wellington looked magnificent. The pastry had puffed up beautifully and was a rich golden brown. The smell of the roasting meat, mixed with the thyme and garlic, filled the small room, making her stomach rumble with hunger and nerves. She transferred the beef to a wooden board to rest, knowing that cutting into it too soon would cause all the juices to run out and spoil the presentation. While the meat was resting, Harriet turned her attention to the gravy. This was often the point where things went wrong. She placed the roasting tin on the hob and whisked in a spoonful of flour,
scraping up all the delicious caramelized bits from the bottom of the pan. She poured in the beef stock and a splash of red wine, stirring frantically to remove any lumps. The liquid bubbled and thickened, transforming into a glossy, dark sauce. She tasted it with a teaspoon, added a pinch of salt and cracked black pepper, and nodded in satisfaction. It was rich and full of flavour. She poured the steaming gravy into a white china jug and placed it on a tray alongside the bowls of honey-roasted carrots and parsnips. She poked her head into the hallway and caught Alistair's eye. He understood the signal immediately. He finished his anecdote about his cricket team and invited everyone to move through to the dining room. There was a scraping of chairs and a shuffling of feet as the guests made their way to the table. Harriet had set it earlier with her grandmother's best silverware and crisp linen napkins. A few tall candles flickered in the centre, creating a cosy and sophisticated ambience. However, as Margaret approached the table, Harriet felt a surge of panic. She watched closely as her boss pulled out the chair positioned right next to the wobbly leg. Alistair noticed it too. His eyes widened slightly and he moved quickly to hold the chair for her, trying to ensure she sat down gently rather than dropping her weight onto the seat.
Margaret sat down and adjusted her napkin on her lap. To everyone's relief, the table held firm. The book Alistair had wedged underneath seemed to be doing its job, although the surface of the table tilted ever so slightly to the left. Harriet brought in the main course, carrying the heavy wooden board with the beef Wellington. She placed it in the center of the table, and a murmur of appreciation went around the group. Even Margaret looked impressed. She put on her glasses and leaned forward to inspect the pastrywork. She commented that making a Wellington from scratch was a brave choice for a Saturday night, implying that many people would have simply bought one from a supermarket. Harriet took this as a compliment and began to carve. The knife crunched through the crisp pastry and sliced easily through the tender meat. The beef was perfectly pink in the middle. Harriet felt a wave of relief wash over her, so strong that her knees felt weak. Plates were passed around and Alistair served the vegetables and poured more wine. For a few minutes there was silence as everyone began to eat. This was usually a good sign in Britain. It meant the food was tasty. Rupert was the first to speak, declaring the beef to be absolutely delicious. Claire agreed, asking for the recipe for the glaze on the carrots. Harriet beamed, finally beginning to enjoy her own party. She took a bite of her food and relaxed into her chair. However, the relaxation was short-lived. As the wine flowed, the conversation shifted away from safe topics and steered dangerously towards work. Margaret wiped the corner of her mouth with her napkin and turned to Harriet. She mentioned that she had been reviewing the budget reports for the upcoming quarter. The atmosphere in the room instantly cooled. Harriet swallowed a piece of potato with difficulty. She knew that budget reviews was corporate code for cost-cutting. Margaret continued, seemingly unaware of the tension, stating that the department needed to be much more streamlined next year. She looked directly at Harriet and said she was planning a significant restructuring of the team. Harriet glanced at Alistair, who was staring at his plate, unsure of how to intervene. Harriet tried to keep her voice steady as she asked what kind of restructuring Margaret had in mind. Before Margaret could answer, Rupert, who had been gesturing enthusiastically with his knife, accidentally knocked his wineglass. The heavy crystal goblet toppled over, hitting the table with a loud thud. Red wine spilled across the white tablecloth, racing towards the edge of the table and right towards Margaret's grey blazer.
Time seemed to slow down completely in the dining room. The dark red liquid spread across the pristine white linen like a river, bursting its banks. Harriet gasped and instinctively lunged forward, grabbing the heavy silver salt cellar. She knew the old housewife's trick: pour salt on red wine immediately to absorb the liquid before it sets into a permanent stain. However, at the exact same moment, Rupert jumped to his feet to apologize, his face turning a bright shade of crimson that matched the wine. In his panic, he pressed his heavy hands down firmly onto the edge of the table to steady himself. That was the final straw for the wobbly leg. The thick hardback book that Alistair had used as a wedge shot out across the wooden floorboards with a loud clatter. The table groaned, tilted sharply to the left, and slid the serving bowl of roasted carrots straight into Claire's lap. For 3 agonizing seconds, there was total silence. The guests froze, staring at the slanted table, the wine-soaked cloth, and the buttery carrots resting on Claire's expensive silk dress. Harriet felt like crying. She closed her eyes, wishing the floor would open up and swallow her whole. The evening was an absolute catastrophe. Her job was under threat, the antique furniture was broken, and she had ruined her friend's dress. She slowly opened her eyes and looked terrified at Margaret, expecting a lecture on incompetence or a cold, disdainful stare. Instead, a strange sound filled the room. It started as a low chuckle in the throat and quickly turned into a loud, booming laugh. Margaret was laughing. She laughed so hard she had to take off her glasses and wipe genuine tears from her eyes. She pointed at Rupert's horrified face and the carrots, declaring it the most exciting dinner party she had attended in a decade. The suffocating tension in the room vanished instantly. Seeing the usually formidable boss in hysterics set everyone else off. Rupert started giggling, apologizing profusely between laughs, while Claire picked a carrot off her knee and jokingly asked if anyone had some spare gravy. Alistair rushed to the kitchen to fetch a roll of kitchen towel and a damp cloth. He helped Claire dab at her dress, assuring her that the dry cleaner's bill would be on them. Realizing the dining table was now completely unusable, they decided to abandon the formal setting entirely. They carried the plates, the surviving wine glasses, and the dessert, a classic English sherry trifle topped with whipped cream and raspberries, into the living room. They sat on the sofas and the floor, eating the sweet pudding with spoons balanced on their knees, surrounded by a comfortable, chaotic mess. The stiff, professional atmosphere was gone, replaced by the warmth of shared adversity. Later, as they were finishing their coffee and eating mint chocolates, Margaret turned to Harriet again. Her voice was soft and sincere,
She brought up the restructuring topic once more, but the threat was gone. Margaret explained that she needed a reliable deputy to help her manage the difficult changes ahead. She said that she needed someone who could handle immense pressure without quitting. And after seeing how Harriet handled the kitchen crisis and the collapsing furniture, she was certain Harriet was the right person for the promotion. She wasn't firing her, she was offering her a better job with more responsibility. Harriet was stunned. She looked across the room at Alistair, who raised his coffee cup in a silent toast, grinning broadly. At midnight, the guests finally stood up to put on their coats. The heavy rain had stopped, leaving the streets outside shimmering under the orange streetlights. There were warm hugs at the door, a stark contrast to the polite handshakes earlier in the evening. Rupert shook Alistair's hand and promised to send the number of a good carpenter to fix the table leg properly. When the front door finally clicked shut, silence returned to the terraced house. Harriet and Alistair walked back into the dining room and looked at the wreckage. The tablecloth was stained pink, the candles had burned down to stumps, and the table was still listing sadly to one side. But Harriet didn't care. She felt lighter than she had in weeks. They decided to leave the washing up until the morning. Alistair turned off the lights and they climbed the stairs together, exhausted but incredibly happy, ready for a good night's sleep. That brings us to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed this lesson and learned some useful vocabulary for talking about hosting, cooking, and dealing with unexpected problems. Remember, even when things go wrong, it often makes for a better story in the end. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more English practice. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.